Hello and welcome to our June Kaleidoscope webinar. We are the Kaleidoscope team from the British Journal of Psychiatry. And what we do is every month we talk about research that we put in our column in the VJ Psych. But if you attend the webinar, you get it a month early. So we're going to talk about papers that we are discussing in July's edition. And we're going to cover a couple of really different things today. We're going to cover speed dating and hallucinations. You're welcome to, the papers are in the show notes if you want to have a look at them. You're welcome to post any comments or questions in the chat. I will try pick them up as we go along. And welcome, I'm excited. We have our first visitor from Japan in the audience today, so you're very welcome. So this webinar reaches places others just don't get to. So I'm going to start with the speed dating paper. I mean, I think this was just clickbait for us. So there's a paper from Frontiers in Psychology, and I found a couple of things really funny with it. They talked at the start that research in romantic attraction reached its pinnacle in the 1960s, something I was completely unaware of. And what I hadn't figured out either was that scientists have divided attraction into 4 different things that can happen to people. There's cognitive, it's what you think when you see someone that you like. There is affective, what you feel about someone when you like them. There's motivational, what you do, and behavioral, getting closer to them. And this paper, so our resident dating expert is Dan, and I think the rest of us know that over many years, Dan's often complained that when he's on dates, that women have said to him how time passes incredibly slowly. Hours feel like months when they're out with them. And my understanding, Dan, is you've got some science that might begin to back this up.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. So the paper is, I think you're identifying it as clickbait probably flags why it became, it got our attention. So it's a study where they argue, I think controversially, that when you observe people in a speed dating situation, so they take, roughly speaking, 18 men and 19 women, they get them to rate each other on physical attractiveness before meeting. Then they have speed dates where they assign people into couples, and they systematically vary the amount of actual time that the speed encounter lasts. And the deal is, when they then afterwards debrief these people and say, right, so earlier you said, this person was this attractive. Afterwards, how much has that changed? And in addition to that, can you also tell us the amount of time you think that particular speed date encounter lasted? And what they found was that when men rated the person attractive, physically attractive, it turns out that they perceived the date as lasting longer, and the opposite was for women. So they showed this, sex difference, and the reason the paper came to my attention was they, in what can only be described as a literary flair, managed to link the Angry Birds movie, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and the history of speed dating, or, historically back to, a group of people in LA that were, looking to find ways to optimize the dating process. So I think the reason
things together.
Yeah. So listen, it jumps out. And I think the reason I picked it was because earlier in the year, I'd read a paper by Lise Elliott called Dump the Dimorphism, which I actually thought was a really compelling piece of work. So Lise Elliott and her group in Chicago had analyzed 30 years of MRI data, spanning a whole bunch of different functional domains and connectivity type analyses and so on. And her group's argument was that if you meta-analyze or synthesize all of that data together, you find that this traditional obsession with men versus women, or so-called sexual dimorphism, is actually completely unsubstantiated by almost all of the literature when you analyze it en masse. So I think the thing that was interesting for it, and it speaks to a paper I think we covered a few months back about unprofessional behavior between male and female people on social media who were trainee surgeons or something. There was some other paper like that. And I think it speaks to that idea, which is scientifically, is there really any value in persisting with sexual dimorphisms and asymmetries? I mean, is it really that important? And I think that the reason this paper jumps out is because it grabs you when you read it because it's kind of funny, but at the end of the day, I'm not actually sure what it contributes. I mean, why does it even matter? And the argument that they make in the paper is from this evolutionary perspective. And I think whenever you start appealing to evolutionary perspectives, it's a blank slate. You can say whatever you want pretty much. So their argument is that their argument is that the time investment for mating for women is substantial because women carry children for 9 months, whereas for men, there's no investment. So their argument is that the cognitive burden of making that assessment is costly for women. So time slows down for women because they're having to do more than just say, oh, this guy's attractive. And the opposite is true for men. They just basically need to presumably impregnate something. So I don't buy these arguments because they strike me as you can't refute them. There's no way really of testing them. Secondly, I was more influenced by Lise Elliott's group's work about whether or not there's even any value in doing sort of, sex difference studies. So I thought it was worth talking about from those two perspectives. One is, is it really interesting or is it just funny? And secondly, do we really think that sex differences is really, is it really important in the study of human behavior? And it would appear not so much. Well, at least, my opinion, not so much.
So you're a modern man. You've moved beyond just impregnating things. But I do agree. I mean, I'm part of the evolutionary psychiatry special interest group at the Royal College. So I have a vested interest here, and I find evolutionary perspectives really interesting. But there is that danger with this that you can retrofit any argument onto. You just observe what happens, and then you build up an evolutionary story. So I can see one man and one woman. Dawn and Sukhi, do you buy it?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I don't know if any of you guys have been speed dating before, but if we consider this to be user experience, I have once speed dated, and it was at a radio show party. Labmate won tickets to the 95.5 Last Chance Pajama Dance. And so a whole giant group of people in Detroit put PJs on and went to this place, and there was speed dating and whatever you can imagine. But so I have speed dated, and I happen to know for a fact that each speed date lasted 95.5 seconds, as was obviously the rule of the night. And I don't personally feel like I was living my best parental investment theory life. But I can tell you that for sure, there was a difference in time perception. There were some that were, so many Earth minutes. But I don't know. So their whole take, and again, I know n of 1 equals nothing, right? But their whole take is that I should have imagined the experience to be a much slower one if I was really attracted to somebody. And I'm just not personally, from my own experience, buying it. Like I quite like the ones where you sort of go in, and by the time you kind of reach a natural break in conversation, 5 hours have passed or whatever. But one thing that they did that I thought was, again, a bit of a reach, but why not, right? If you're throwing in all of evolutionary theory and you've got 38 participants and you've done way too many statistical tests to probably shoulder that, you might as well. They went into dopamine, and they went into reward, and they went into hormones, and they sort of boldly stated that, in fact, estradiol, but only in women, controls a dopamine rewards response. And so if we were in fact attracted, it would cause this dopamine response. And it instantly just smelled foul to me, because in fact, everybody responds with a dopamine response to attractiveness. And in fact, I think Helen Fisher's work at Rutgers, she's been doing this for ages, and she's shown that actually there's sort of two aspects of the dopamine reward response to attraction. And sort of left ventral tegmental area gives you that sort of pleasure reaction to beauty. So that could be to a person, but it could also be to art or whatever. And it's the right side that's kind of romantic love. And so if you're going to throw down dopamine and you can't tell me the difference between those two, I'm not sure I'd buy it.
Yeah, isn't it the last attempt of a rogue just to throw in a neurotransmitter? It's like adding Bayesian in, isn't it? Just a way of confusing the pitch. So it feels to me that we've a sense that, time, we've all been in those moments where time is going far slower than we'd wish, or it's passing really quickly. It seems to be the issue of whether there's gender difference. Sukhi, what do you think?
Time perception seems to be a really interesting area. So I think on that basis that I think it's an interesting, the fact that they're looking at it. And the second thing that I quite liked was that it was an attempt to use live kind of dyadic experience with how two people were interacting. and then having a look at that rather than just the more routine thing about just showing folk a bunch of pictures and saying, how long, have you looked at that? And, do you find it attractive or not? So I kind of think that, to me, they look to be, I think the study, I agree with all of you, that it's a relatively superficial piece of scientific work with quite a lot of flaws. And the kind of most prominent flaws for me were really around the fact that if the basis of your hypotheses is that it's the amount of material you're packing into that time, which is determining your perception of its duration, which is their kind of argument, was that because one gender is more invested, it is using that time to really integrate a whole bunch of different data, and the other gender is actually just using that space just to code one or two salient features only. So therefore, if you ask them at the end, how long did that experience last? The one that had to pack in quite a lot of data collection, laid down quite a lot of memories, perceived that as lasting quite a long time. And the one that only had one or two tracks laid down found that was quite a short period. But that was a testable hypothesis, right? So you could actually ask folk at the end for a random selection of details or checklist about how much information did they manage to lay down. So you could actually, you didn't have to say this was all predicated on kind of evolutionary basis. You could actually test your theory at a slightly more fine grain than was obvious. And the second thing, I guess, is about the actual design, that this allows you. So one of the things they kind of say in passing in the paper is they say, if you bias people, if you give them information to say, this person is a fantastic, volleyball player, or, is a real outstanding athlete and looks after their parents, and does work with charitable institutions, then people's attractiveness rating will go up. So clearly you can look at biases and its impact on that particular interaction. And so therefore that opens it up to quite a lot of interesting research from the mental health point of view, where, for example, we're all quite vexed about the idea that stigma around mental health is such an enormous issue, and it's really difficult to try and resolve. And it will, if we can resolve it to some degree, it'll actually have quite a big positive beneficial effect for, you might argue, for the community as a whole. But these kind of live experiments allow you to begin to tease out some aspects of those kind of very difficult to get at and really very sensitive to virtue signaling and kind of social conformity type things, where you can actually use this kind of design, put some information in advance around whether people have mental health difficulties or not. And then it may also then be a clever way of testing whether some of your interventions will make people more robust to those kind of those biases that we would like to treat. And I guess the second thing is it also offers that particular approach where you're giving people some information in advance, which is biasing their experience of a stimulus or an interaction, is also at fundamentally the basis of the next experiment that you're going to go on to talk about as well. So I think it has value as a heuristic rather than the detail itself. And I disagree with Derek. I think that gender differences are really important because we know that they're biologically derived. And if we just treat folk just as one homogeneous mass, I think we do them a slight disservice. And the way that society is often structured means that we tend to do one particular gender more of a disservice than the other. So I think actually it is quite important to be able to look at that and to be able to take that into account. So that's the third thing that this study offers beyond quite a useful heuristic and a design that can help us in real live interaction.
Okay, so there's something interesting to the methodology. I mean, I think probably most people will buy some gender differences with taking them at broad brushstroke levels. But I suppose maybe it's the evolutionary tack on is the thing that we struggle with a bit. There are a couple of comments. So Salim says, to me, it makes evolution and hormonal makes sense that evolution and hormonal processes mean there might be gender differences, but I can't see any meaning in them here. So again, maybe that's the issue about maybe it's the evolutionary tag on. I wonder if that's where I struggle a bit, because I think this is the danger of the field of evolutionary psychology, which I always find seductive to read. It's always really interesting to me. But you just describe what you've got, and then you say that you pin it onto an evolutionary basis. And Leah has said, I don't know about this study specifically regarding time. Men and women are inherently different. I'll be the last to suggest the same. And Sukhi made a good point. That's new for us. It doesn't normally happen, but it's good to see that about Sukhi. And Corinne said sex differences or gender differences. So that's a really interesting point too. And of course, that's a complex debate as well, whether you're talking about the sex, which is what people will often use to describe someone at their point of birth, what their gender is, or what they're biologically at birth, and gender is how people will identify too. And it's important, of course, I think, to look at the paper too. It's also from, I guess, from a heterosexual narrative too. So the basis about heterosexual couples, and so there's lots of stuff that wasn't gone into in that paper too. And Abigail, I think it'd be helpful to look at sex slash gender, but I'm not convinced by this particular study. Yeah, and actually, which is also Abigail saying that's part of what I mentioned there about being heteronormative. So how much would apply to non-binary or transgender? And I think absolutely, and it's something that they didn't address within it. Okay, so I think there's some skepticism. We can see some value within it. I'm tempted to make a joke about men exaggerating about things being shorter than they really are for once, but I'll move on from that, I guess. We got a different paper from Science, and this paper, I think, although there was some debate before we came on here, we're having our pre-webinar chat, I think in general we feel this is a very well-constructed paper and quite a complex and technical one. There's really lots to unpack here, and it's looking at the idea of hallucinations. So hallucinations are where you have a perception, so you see or hear or taste or feel something, but there's nothing that caused it. And something related to that, but not quite the same, is an illusion where you misperceive. So you see or hear something, but you mistake it to be something else. And hallucinations are not uncommon. They happen in lots of the population. Sometimes they can be associated with mental ill health and with mental illness. And the classic example that's sometimes given is in schizophrenia or psychoses, but they can occur in other conditions such as depression and bipolar affective disorder. So there's lots of interest in understanding hallucinations. They can be really, really distressing for people at times. One of the challenges from a mental health neurobiology perspective is a key, if we think about schizophrenia particularly or psychosis particular, dopamine has been a key compound, which Sukhi mentioned earlier on, and most of our antipsychotic medication, in fact, all the main antipsychotic medications work by blocking dopamine. So we think that must be important when people have psychoses. But linking dopamine with, for example, your auditory cortices and how you hear things has been a bit of a struggle. So this is a really interesting paper, and it starts off with mice. So a starting question for Dawn is, how would you know if mice were hallucinating? What can we learn? Mice can't talk to us, right?
Exactly, which was why I was so excited to see this paper from Katerina Schmack at Cold Spring Harbor and Adam Kepecs at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. So if we rewind with me back a million years ago to when I was a PhD student, and I went to a talk from somebody in a lab that was also looking at drugs of abuse, but doing it from the human subject participant perspective. So bringing people into a lab, giving them drugs, asking about their experience. And they were talking about things like oceanic boundlessness, right? All sorts of dissociative states and really wild, kind of big ideas. And I remember a very flip kind of throwaway comment, which was that hallucinations were a uniquely human experience. And I also very much remember going incredibly internal on that and thinking, maybe, right? Because of course, perhaps the scale of them or the nature of the details is going to be influenced by what we've got up in our brains. But they are a full stimulation of a sensory system, which is well conserved across species. And so really the idea that we couldn't find them in animals is perhaps that they don't have it, or more likely just a failure of our imagination. And these guys came in and gave us what I think is probably the first really solid attempt at a translational model of hallucinations. So for me, it was a joy to see and really exciting. And it's so simple in terms of the actual sort of nuts and bolts, but don't be confused, because actually underneath the surface is incredibly detailed, beautifully technical paper. But the gist is the following. If you imagine that hallucinations are just false perceptions, right? So it would be a true perception if something was really there. If it's not, it's false. And that you feel really confident that you experienced it. You can kind of break these things down into these two sort of planes. Did it actually occur? Do you feel confident that you experienced it? And what they did was create a system by which they had static, so white noise in the background, and they would play tones at varying volumes and whatever. And they trained both people and rats to indicate when they thought they heard the tone. So they both would essentially press a lever. One, the rats or the mice would go with their little nose into a specific area. And they would ask the people how confident they felt, but they could measure confidence in rats by how long they were willing to wait for a reward, because ultimately that's a really standard metric used in translational stuff. If they're sure, they will wait because they know it's coming, right? So you've got this system where you can set people and animals up with the exact same experimental conditions, white noise, a stimulus or not, and check to see how often they think they've heard this experience. Now, of course, when they think they've heard it, but it wasn't there, and they're really confident in it, we would consider that to be a false perception or a hallucination. And of course, this whole thing is based on the idea that triggered false perception would be linked neurologically to a spontaneous false perception that we would see in psychosis or schizophrenia. But what they found was that for humans, the likelihood to experience these hallucinations was directly related to their sort of vulnerability to seeing or to experiencing them in regular life. And that was based on a self-report questionnaire. And they could take a look at the mice and they could see that when they did manipulations that we know increase hallucinations in people, like giving them ketamine, they too had the same increase in hallucinations. So we've got this really lovely parallel, and we can tie it to a vulnerability of hallucinations in human beings. We can see how it translates into rats. And of course, coming back to the dopamine thing that you mentioned before, we know that increased dopamine is associated with hallucinations, and particularly in the striatum. And they were able to go in and use optogenetics, which is a very cool technique. It's been around for a little bit of time. And actually, I'm writing my next K article about it. But optogenetics is the opportunity to sort of genetically alter neurons, and you're able to then control them with light. So very cool stuff. And they were able to separate out kind of what was it that the animals were anticipating? Was it that they were anticipating the reward, which we all do, and that's kind of a different thing? Or was it that they were anticipating the perception? And using optogenetics, they could increase dopamine exclusively in the tail part of the striatum and find that increase in hallucination. So it wasn't reward, it was perceptual. And they put it into some computational modeling and basically found that the culprit, according to them, was prior experience. That in fact, dopamine, the presence of dopamine, excessive at baseline, seems to give rise to the likelihood of hallucination-like perceptions. So to kind of wrap it all up in a nice, thank you, Leah, to wrap it all up in a nice bow, effectively, what's so amazing about it to me is that we've had this hypothesis. We feel really confident that there is this connection between excess dopamine and hallucinations. Nobody could tell you how it worked. And this provides a potential mechanism, which at the very least can be tested. But what I'm hoping to throw back to you guys is I happened to check the author out on Twitter. And when she was talking about this paper, the thing she was most excited about was not any of the stuff I've just mentioned, but actually the computational psychiatry approach. And so I was hoping that perhaps you could tell me, what is computational psychiatry and what can it do for me that regular adding and subtracting psychiatry cannot?
It's up to the other two boys. Who's going to come in on that? Sukhi?
I think I'll pass the computational question on to Dan, because no point in having somebody with a PhD in these kind of computational approaches and computer science undergrad if I'm going to answer these questions with my humble kind of medical degree. Actually, I'll let him talk about the computational psychiatry first, and I can talk a little bit about what I think the clinical relevance of it is.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button.
He can't unmute, but trust me on his analysis.
So there's been a flourish, hasn't there? It's fair to say a flourish of activity around computational psychiatry, and the name computational psychiatry, I've always thought was a bit. I was surprised by it when I first heard it because it struck me as computational neuroscience applied to a pathology, right? So I was curious as to what the tools are and how they're different from computational neuroscience, and I don't know I have an answer to that. But I've got to tell you, I mean, the thing, interestingly, Dawn, the thing that amazed me about this paper was, or excited me about this paper, was the translational component, which is the idea that you've got essentially a tool. It's an alternative force choice, classic psychophysics experiment. With all of the problems and frustrations that those types of experiments entail. And Sukhi will back me up on this because we spend hours of our lives, or days, weeks of our lives trying to do these experiments historically. So I think that point comes back around later, but the thing that I really liked was not so much the computational angle, which, you know, I think you can, it's a bit like evolutionary psychiatry. You can retrofit anything pretty much and just say, yeah, it's Bayesian because you've got a prior which encodes how you expect the world to be. You've got a likelihood which tells you the probability of, you know, this event given, you know, some functional description of it, and then you multiply the two things together. So I was less excited by that, but more excited by the idea that you can find a psychometric task or a psychophysical task that you can translate between mice and people, and the results agree. That's pretty cool, because then what you then go on to do mechanistically, whether it's via a computational framework or whether it's just pure biology, in terms of the manipulations here, you know, they use optogenetics to manipulate, I think it was the ventral striatum and the tail of the dorsal striatum. So again, it's back to striatal dopamine modulation of prediction error. So, you know, in that respect, it's a fairly familiar story. But now that you're making that manipulation in your model species, you can then say, so maybe it's something like what happens in people. I think that's the bit that probably excites Sukhi the most. So yeah, that's the thing that really blew me away about this, was for the first time, I can remember the first time I went to a journal club meeting about mouse models of schizophrenia. This is before I had no medical training at all. I was sat there just thinking, how do you know that a mouse has schizophrenia? I don't get it. You know, I waited till the end to ask this question, and was then met with a lot of people rolling their eyes saying, you know, oh, for God's sake, you know, that's just pedantry on your part, Sunshine. So yeah, anyway, that's my take on it. I haven't digested their computational model in detail, but it looks like, you know, from the article, it's prior updating on the basis of prediction error. So that didn't excite me quite as much. But the fact that it marries with a mechanistic mouse model, and that marries with psychophysics in humans, is just awesome. I think that's my final point about it. That's just a remarkable piece of work. What do you reckon, Sukhi?
I think it's impossible to disagree that it's a really beautiful piece of scientific work where you can't in any one study, you can't answer all the questions. So I'm sure, you know, I would have liked to have seen the same manipulation that they used in the mice to boost dopaminergic signal in the folk they were using, to show that it actually had the same direction. You may not have been able to get the specificity of which bit of the striatum you were tuning, but to show that either tonic or phasic influence actually had the similar effect would have been quite an interesting thing, or some measure of dopaminergic tone in these folk that correlated with their propensity to actually experience kind of hallucinatory like experience. I think the study is really cool. So I think it's really one of those things that's worth reading in detail. And I wouldn't recommend that. Probably only 1% of the research papers that I read would I suggest that it's actually worth going through it in detail. And it's quite nice because the way it's set out, they give you a kind of one-page synopsis for lazy folk like myself. And then it gives you a kind of 4-page formal description of what happened and how things were done, for where there's sufficient detail for people to tease out what the actual process of it was. So I think actually just seeing that higher level description and a detail of the science, I think is an interesting experience for people who are early on in their career in science, to see that there's a level of detail that you need to provide so people can replicate that work. But if you just leave it at that, it's almost incomprehensible for 90% of folk to kind of really say, what's the message, what's the elevator pitch? What does this actually tell us? And I think having that kind of explanatory higher order thing is really important. And it looks like it's much more important for the kind of more prominent work that's likely to be more highly cited, or these journals that have a lot of selectivity in what they pick. So I think nothing to criticize on the kind of design of what they've done. I guess the application of it to patients with schizophrenia, I think, is a little bit forced if you were being a little bit critical, because there are actually no patients with schizophrenia in that study, and yet they talk about schizophrenia quite a bit. They use this model of taking people's propensity to have hallucinatory experience, which is basically a questionnaire type measure, which says, I was sitting in the car and I heard a voice behind me. But it's qualitatively and quantitatively different from the experience of having the hallucination. So I think that easy translation is kind of nice at the higher order thing, to say this may have meaning for the experience that patients with schizophrenia may have, or who experience hallucinations. But this doesn't, if you're very strict, this doesn't tell you really anything about that, because the sample that they've chosen are people who have hallucination proneness. So an example of that might be that there's quite a lot of interest in folk who have some attenuated symptoms of psychosis. You might hear a voice occasionally, or you might become a little bit paranoid. And so these so-called ultra high risk people for psychosis have aroused a lot of interest, because if this is the mechanism by which schizophrenia arises, then maybe we can intervene at this really early stage and stop people from developing this devastating illness. But over the last 15 years or so of that kind of research, that promise hasn't really been fulfilled. And one of the main reasons why that promise hasn't been fulfilled is because the ultra high risk profile of having some of these symptoms does not translate very well into the folk who develop a psychotic illness or schizophrenia. So very, very few of those folk, if you follow them up, actually develop schizophrenia. A lot of them will develop mental health disorders. So this model may tell you something actually slightly broader about mental health, rather than the very narrow focus that they've picked for this paper, which is essentially saying that this is something that may be really relevant to schizophrenia. And the second thing I would say is that this isn't a new field. So the computational psychiatry approach has been used, and this idea of looking at this broad concept of how do patients with schizophrenia make decisions, and why do they look like they can't be corrected? So if I tell you that the FBI isn't doing something, and the sound isn't being transmitted through various optical devices into my brain, and my mum tells me that, or my friends tell me that, the news tells me that, I won't correct my belief system. I will continue to hold the delusional belief that I might have that this is caused or precipitated by a certain event. So why is there that failure of correction? Why can you not use your so-called prior information? So all of this experience of knowing this is how events arrive in my perceptual system. I'm happy to ignore all of that in the favor of having some hallucinatory or perceptual abnormalities. So this integration between prior knowledge and the current sensory experience, how you meld those together looks like it's dysfunctional in schizophrenia, but the results of the data that I've seen, and there's some elegant work done by Dr. Joyce, looking at how patients with schizophrenia have integrated prior information with their kind of current sensory evidence to try and see whether they can recognize patterns in other people's data, suggests that actually people are not terribly overly sensitive to this prior distribution and prior experience. They are much more likely to weight the current evidence. There's a paper from, I think, last year by Walton, I think, which again looks at kind of direction of moving massive of dots on a screen and asks patients with schizophrenia to judge whether it's moving in one direction or another. And it shows a very strong bias of prior information in healthy people to develop a hallucinatory experience of dots moving. But that, in their experience, the patients with schizophrenia who did that weren't able to use this prior, they didn't overvalue this prior experience to have this kind of hallucinatory perception. So it's not, the translation of this looks like it still needs a little bit more work. I think the elegance of the approach is to really to be admired, and the kind of clarity of thought to be able to do that work is really, you know, it's inspiring, I think.
Yeah, I think elegance is a lovely word with that. I just thought it was a masterful piece of work. I mean, I take what you say about having people with those lived experiences not being as much part of it, but I think almost every other question I could think of when I was approaching the paper, they had thought of it, they'd answered it, which isn't always the case. And I also agree that if people are listening and interested in the papers, the science is obviously a really important, high impact journal, but that cover sheet, for want of a better word, that front page is a really neat description, and all the technical detail is behind it if you want to look, but it's a really nice description of it. There's a comment from Corinne that's so very interesting. I like the fact that some professionals are really focusing on the function of seeing or hearing experiences that others do not see or hear, with the view of empowering individuals to manage them. Of course, not at the level of psychosis, but lower down the spectrum, so to speak. And I think that probably echoes what we've been saying with this too. It's just a lovely piece. I don't know if you have any final comments on that, Tom.
I want to hear Joyce. He was just baited.
He's smart enough not to come back to Sukhi on that. That's a conversation for another day. I think we're going to have to begin to bring this to an end. So we hope you enjoyed the webinar today. We hope that time passed either very fast or very slow, depending on your background and how you found it. And we hope we see you next month. Thanks for joining us.
Good night, everybody.